Today I invited Jon Wilson, a famous professor of King College, UK. I am going to discuss about his new book that is coming soon.
Soonish.
Congratulations for your new project, for your new write-up. I am trying to sum up your idea about your book that you mentioned in your biography here. So, why you are writing this research project? Because you have many options. You can write anything across the globe. Why you are interested in Bangladeshi history?
So the new book is not just on Bangladesh. It's on it's a global history of the nation state. But I'm back in Bangladesh because this is where my research career started. My first work was on East Bengal, and I think it's a really interesting place to think about global history from. Somewhere that's shaped by global forces and yet has its own power and its own agency, if you like, to kind of to some degree create its own destiny. And I think it's fascinating, particularly to be thinking about the history of the nation state in a place that developed, had a kind of liberation war to create a nation state at I guess a relatively late point in time in the 1970s. So and where kind of nationalism, ideas about nationality are still very, very important.
Yeah, it is good. Sounds good, and I like your project. But I have interest about the issue that you raised in your last presentation. That is about chaos. So you mentioned out of chaos, a global history of the rise and fall of the nation state.
Yeah.
So not only in this book title, but also you wrote another book, another article, and all three cases you mentioned the term chaos. Why chaos?
So I think we have a tendency as historians and as people thinking about politics to assume that politics occurs in this ordered, rational way. So either people are acting out ideologies that are very well stable and well formed, or they're working to further particular kind of stable interests. And I just think, partly someone who's been involved in politics, been a political activist, and has been close to politicians, recognizing that that's just not how politics happens. It's not how people think about practically exercise political power, and it's not how institutions work. And I think that a lot of the time we live in complex, plural, often quite conflictual, if you like, societies. And what political leaders and what political institutions are trying to do is to try to make sense of tension, conflict, and chaos. And I'm interested, I suppose, and it's something I've been interested in throughout my research career, is how political institutions and political leaders try and impose some kind of order for themselves, to make meaning for themselves, but also to project a sense of order onto that kind of So I suppose I think that there's something quite I suppose in a way maybe it comes from Nietzsche or someone, I don't know, but the idea that kind of fundamentally there's chaos everywhere, and that human existence is about trying to kind of impose order on that. Maybe that's going too far, but certainly in terms of thinking about 20th century politics, that chaos has been something that political leaders have constantly felt threatened by and have constantly tried to develop ways to push away.
It is good, I think, that you mentioned a new term for writing South Asian history, and it is very meaningful with the context. I think so. But I would like to know, you mentioned Bangladesh and the global history of the nation state in your last presentation that was organized by the Asiatic Society of Bangladesh. Why you would like to connect Bangladesh with the global history?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's just because I'm very interested in Bangladesh, and it's where, as I said, where I sort of began my research career. I'm in the National Archives, which is where a lot of the sources for my first research project were. So it's somewhere that I always think about, always go back to. But I think that there's something particularly interesting about the history of Bangladesh in that it became a nation state, if you like, out of another nation state, or out of a state that was at least claiming to be a nation state, although there's extraordinary inequality within the two wings of Pakistan. And so I think that, if you like, the particularity of Bangladesh allows you to explore, to unravel some of the things that maybe we don't properly understand about the kind of post-war political order. How could you have this nation state that had two wings that broke up so quickly? I think if you like, not just seeing Pakistan as an aberration, but actually saying, wait a minute, this is a state that people thought was viable, and for a while it maybe was viable. What does that mean? How do we take that seriously? How do we need to rethink the history of the nation state or the history of the process that led to the nation state to make sense of this kind of otherwise quite strange kind of polity? So I think thinking about the global from this local and regional perspective sort of gives you this other angle that forces you to actually rethink things potentially quite fundamentally.
I read your booklet that you printed for the presentation, and from first page to last page.
Thank you.
But I did not find any word related to the comparative history.
Sure. Yeah.
I think that your project is very much related to the field of comparative history rather than the global history. What do you think?
So what's the difference? How do you define the difference?
Global history is more wide than comparative history.
Sure.
If you know the books of Mark Bloch, Historian's Craft, if you read the book, you know what is the global history, the idea of global history, and what is the idea of comparative history. So I think that it is very different idea. If you want to compare between the global idea of global history and the idea of comparative history, it is not the same. So what do you think?
So I think I'm doing global history, not comparative history. I deliberately don't talk about comparative history because I think that the problem, if you like, with comparative history is it takes for granted what the units are that you're comparing, right? So actually often comparative history ends up, I think, consolidating a kind of nation-state centeredness, if you like. So you end up with a view that you compare this nation with this nation with this nation. And so the worst kind of comparative history are people like Francis Fukuyama in The Origins of Modern Political Order, for example, where you just get this, almost like league table of comparing different aspects of different societies. And I think the problem that comparative history has, and the reason why I'm not a comparative historian, is that actually there is a process of global interconnection, that things are happening in a complicated way on a global scale at the same time. And that's so to say, I don't think I'm a comparative historian, for example, about the creation of Pakistan, because what I'm trying to say is that actually Pakistan becomes a nation state as local forces operate, but those local forces are constantly connecting to broader global forces, and it's within institutions such as the United Nations that actually you get a sense of the nation state emerging as a kind of generic category. So I think the reason why I think you might not see me as a global historian is that I'm not just interested in the history of globalization and what we might see as the most superficial forms of global connection, because I think actually the ways in which societies are divided from each other often occur according to global norms, if you see what I mean. The nation state, or say, for example, national statistics, which are all about the separateness of different nation states, or even national customs regimes, which are all about stopping the flow of goods, limiting the flow of goods between different nations. These all occur in a global context as part of a global conversation, and often based on global forms. So national statistics are produced according to the same categories across the world, and yet actually they're very much about the separateness of different nation states. So I think that's why people might look at my work and think, oh, I'm not writing global history, because usually global history is all about looking at, the flow of global goods, the way in which societies are interconnected, etc. And I think I'm not the only historian to say this now, but I think actually we need a different kind of global history, which is not just about global interconnection, but about global, but about global context, the global context for the creation of nation states and local societies.
I see you mention it or noticed about the Sheikh Mujibur Rahman
Yeah,
speech.
yeah.
Uh,
In the United Nations.
yes.
Yeah.
You quoted, "We no longer want to live in a colony."
Oh, this is an
As
early
Mujib
speech in 1972.
put in it February 1971.
Yeah, 71.
So,
Sorry, yeah.
do you think that Pakistan ruled over Bangladesh as colonial ruler?
No, I think I understand why that rhetoric's used. It's politically important. It politically makes absolute sense. It's an easy frame of reference for people to understand, and maybe it's the nearest frame of reference. But I think it's important to be specific about the kinds of power that exists. And I think that there was oppression, there was inequality, there was certainly injustice. But I'm not convinced that the particular model that you see of, if you like, inequality, etc., makes sense. It makes sense to kind of refer to Pakistan as in terms of a colonial model. I think actually, to be honest, I don't like the category of colonial at all. I think that you need to be more specific about the forms of power and so forth that they imply. I mean, I think when you talk about colonial, I think normally you're talking about resource extraction. You're talking about sort of the occupation of a group of people, and then the creation of plantations, etc., etc. And that's not a particular mode of exploitation, if you like, that was occurring in Pakistan. So, but I think for Mujib, I mean, if I was Mujib in that context, I would have used that word, because it's I'm speaking as a historian, not as a politician. I think as a politician, it makes sense, because it's an easy frame of reference for people to understand, and makes perfect sense.
So, what do